Hello, it's Pat Muchmore again. I made a video last week explaining one of the crazy titles off of my new album, Babel Fragments, and at least as far as these niche things go, it had a somewhat interesting response. People seemed to be intrigued, so I wanted to make one more of those to explain one of the other titles on the piece. Last time I talked about this piece, Babel Maya. This time I want to talk about the last piece on the record called SHESHACH Maya, and once again I would blow my mind if I tried to do that in reverse form like this, so instead let's go to my screen. Once again, here's the back cover for Babel Fragments. In the previous video, I talked about this title, which I sometimes refer to as Babel Maya. This time I want to talk about this title, the last piece on the record, which is called SHESHACH Maya. As you can probably tell, there's a lot of relation between these two tracks. In fact, this piece was written essentially as a companion piece to this one. Both have 5 movements, and both are members of my Babel series of pieces. So let's take a look at a clearer view. This is the title we talked about in the previous video, and here is the new title that we're talking about. One thing that you'd surely notice is, just as there was this f of 1 exponent in the previous video, there is an f of 3 marking here in this title. That's because both of these pieces, as explained in the previous video, are members of my f of x series as well as my Babel series, which means they have a lot of other things contained inside them, pieces within pieces, melodies within melodies. The reason for the different number is just that this is the first piece that I wrote in that series, and this one was the third. So that's all there really is to say about that part of the title. When it comes to the more complex visual part of the title, there is a bit more to say. You can probably tell there's some visual similarities even between those parts, but there's obviously a lot of difference as well. As I explained in the previous video, my Babel pieces are always named with the word Babel that is transliterated into 5 different scripts. So the B of Babel gets rendered in whatever the equivalent of B is in one script. The A of Babel gets rendered in whatever the equivalent of A is in yet another script, etc. This piece brings up another complication that I didn't go into much detail about then. The word being transliterated with these sequence of symbols is actually not Babel, it's this word, SHESHACH. Now, SHESHACH is actually just essentially a code word for Babel. It gets used in a couple of places in the Hebrew Bible. I believe both instances happen in the book that's called Jeremiah. And for a long time, it was a bit of a mystery what town was being referred to by this name, SHESHACH. But eventually people have realized, and I believe at this point all biblical scholars agree, it's actually just code for Babel or Babylon. And the first thing I wanted to explain is how that could be the case, but it's going to take a little bit of background to get there. In the previous video, I used the differences between the ancient Mayan writing system and our Mayan writing system to try to give a clear sense of just how difficult the seemingly simple task of transliteration might be. I want to go to what would seem to be a simpler example to show that that complication doesn't go away in even some of the most straightforward instances. For example, let's say we wanted to take the word Babel here and transliterate it into Greek. Entirely into Greek. We're not going to use multiple languages. We're not trying to confuse anybody here. We're just trying to make it so someone who reads only Greek would pronounce a word that more or less sounds the same as our word Babel. Or if you prefer Babel, the version we're going to give them is actually going to be closer to that anyway. One of the first things you'd probably do is look up basically a conversion chart, a romanization chart it's called. Here's an example of one. I apologize for the poor quality. Here you can see a one-to-one comparison of English letters here, or I should say Latin letters, and the Greek letters that they can correspond with. So what you might do is look for the letter B. Here it is right there, and you see that the character beta would stand for that. Not so surprising, that looks awfully familiar, especially the uppercase version. Then you'd look around and see here's A, and that tells you to use alpha. And you look for the E here, still easy. And finally, here's an L, which we could use with either the uppercase or the lowercase here. And so what you would do naively, but understandably, is take this Babel in English and convert it to either this uppercase situation or this lowercase situation here. And you'd probably feel pretty damn good about it because both of these things actually look virtually identical to our English spelling of the same word. That's not a coincidence, of course, since this Greek character set is actually a progenitor of the character set that we still use. However, if you give this to a modern person who speaks Greek, then they'd probably pronounce something along the lines of vavel, v instead of b, and that's actually quite a bit different from what we were hoping for. Incidentally, if you were to give this to an ancient Greek, we're fairly certain it would be pretty close to what we want him to say, but I don't think you're going to find any of those, and so you'd end up with vavel. That V sound is actually the character that we call beta. They actually call it vita in modern Greek. There actually is no character in modern Greek that creates the sound B. That's not to say you can't spell it, however. If I wanted to get a modern reader of Greek to pronounce something along the lines of Babel or Babel, I could give them this. Now that looks substantially more complicated. For one thing, it takes more characters, it's longer, and for another, it doesn't really look anything like it's going to pronounce as Babel or Babel in our understanding of the language. In fact, if you try to now reverse everything and reverse transliterate back into English, you would think that this is this, and you'd think somehow mpampol or something like that is the word being encoded here. That's just an idiosyncrasy of Greek writing, and it's something that they learn at a very young age and seems absolutely transparent to them, but seems very weird to those of us who aren't fluent. Basically, the characters mu and pi, that's actually what we call them, they'd call them mi and pi, do not equate to mp or mp in our language, but rather make the same B sound that we get when we write the letter B. That's just how the language works. This combination of consonant symbols actually makes a single consonant, even though it looks like two consonants. Now, don't get feeling all high and mighty if you're an English speaker. This seems like a strange complication, but we have them all over the place in our own language. For instance, sh. This sound, sh, is never sh, which is what those two consonants would seem to imply. It's actually a completely other consonant, sh, that is made a little bit further back in the mouth than the s sound that the s encodes. This sh sound is a single consonant that we write using two consonant symbols. This is something that just kind of evolved over the centuries of English writing and is not indicative of anything in particular. It seems really obvious and transparent to those of us who have always known English spelling, but is actually a source of a great deal of confusion in when people that speak and read other languages try to learn English. Many languages have a single character for this sh sound. For instance, if I tried to transliterate this sound into Hebrew, I would end up with this character, shin. Actually, it's even a little bit more complicated than that. This character here is capable of being either an S sound or an SH sound, depending on context. And actually, there's a little dot you can add to one side or the other if you feel like you need to be specific. But in most cases, context alone would turn this into a sh sound when you need it to be. In other words, they have one character for this sound, just like we have one character for the B sound that was talked about a second ago. So, let's go back to our original question. How can the word Babel turn into the word SHESHACH? how is SHESHACH code for Babel? It seems rather far-fetched. This word is quite a bit longer than this word. It involves quite a bit more characters, at least. And it turns out that's because we're asking the wrong question. This code wasn't using Latin. This code was using Hebrew. And therefore, instead of asking how this could be rendered as this, we should be asking how this could be rendered as this. This is the Hebrew writing for Babel or something like that. My pronunciation is terrible. This is the Hebrew writing for SHESHACH. So already it seems a little bit clearer how the one could become the other, because at least it's the same number of characters. 3 characters becomes 3 characters. This code is in fact named after the Hebrew alphabet. It's called the Atbash cipher. And the way it works is you take your alphabet, or more accurately in Hebrew, it's not an alphabet, it's called an abjad. That's something that's like an alphabet, but it doesn't have symbols for vowels. That, by the way, explains why, although our English spelling of Babel has 5 letters, the Hebrew spelling actually only has 3 letters. Anyway, here is the Hebrew abjad, and if we take it and cut it at the halfway point and fold it back on itself, it would look something like this. Here's, remember, Hebrew reads right to left, so here's the start with the character Aleph. It goes around, and then when you get to the end of this line, go backwards to the end of the Hebrew abjad Tav. The way the Atbash cipher works is you find whatever letter you have in your word, and you basically just replace it with the letter from the other side. So, for instance, the first character in our word Babel was this one here. So all we need to do is take that character and replace it with the character on the other side of the table here, and hence B becomes SH. Again, that's just one character becoming one other character, but in English it looks like one character becoming 2 characters, just because we don't have a symbol for the sh sound. Anyway, the B becomes sh, the other B becomes sh, and then finally here is our L sound, which becomes this character here, kaf, or chaf, as it is in this case. So BBL becomes sh, cha, or Babel becomes SHESHACH. Here's an example using the Latin alphabet we use for English, just to make it a little bit clearer about what's going on. Here we go, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M. At that point, we've hit the halfway mark, and we switch, go backwards, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. So if I wanted to take the word pat and cipher it using the Atbash cipher, my P would become a K, my A would become a Z, and my T would become a G. And so I'd write KZG as a code for PAT. At any rate, that's how this can be a code for this, and therefore how Babel can become SHESHACH. The rest of the explanation is relatively simple as long as you remember the previous video. That was about the second piece on the record, which, if you'll recall, was named using Mayan hieroglyph Ba, Futark A, Morse code Da, Dit, Dit, Dit for B, Korean for E, and Greek for the L. I used all the same languages, but instead of writing the word Babel, remember I'm writing the word SHESHACH. This required a bunch of compromises, and the compromises are kind of the point here. One of the things I want to get at is just how not one-to-one the conversion from one script to another script is. For example, I chose to use Korean for the first consonant of SHESHACH. In, as we've discussed, English, that's 2 characters, but it's really just one consonant. So I chose to represent both S and H using Korean alphabet, both. However, this actually is total nonsense to somebody who knows Korean. You can't have 2 consonants next to each other like this. And in fact, this combination of a S sound and a H sound doesn't make any sense at all. That's because, actually, much like Hebrew, they use the same character for both the S sound and the Sh sound. The context would make it very clear whether this was a S or a Sh. But of course, this isn't actually a Korean word. There is no context for it. And the strange ambiguity between two characters and one consonant is something I kind of wanted to embrace and well, problematize in this particular title. So I made this completely illegal combination of Korean characters, in part to emphasize the weirdness and the strangeness of the English transliteration of SHESHACH. At any rate, I used Korean for the sh part of it. I used Greek for the E. Here, once again, we have two characters standing in for a single consonant. This time, futark is both the S and the H. Then we get our Mayan hieroglyph, this little turtle-looking guy. I think it's actually a macaw or something like that, but it's always looked like a turtle to me. This stands for the vowel A. You may recall in the previous video I said that there are no standalone consonants in the Mayan writing system because it's a syllabary. There are, however, in a sense, standalone vowels, and I won't go into the details of it, but this is one of the ways that you could write the standalone vowel A. Finally, we have da, ti, da, which is Morse code for a k sound. There is no Morse code that I'm aware of, at least, for the ch sound that we're really looking for here. So the only thing left to explain is the jumbling of languages. I didn't use the same order as I did when I made my Babel title. That's because there's an extra level of companionship between these two pieces when it comes down to the movement level. And basically I wanted to mirror whatever form I used for the piece that used Mayan in this piece, Babel Maya. That's the first movement. I wanted to mirror that form in the fourth movement of the SHESHACH piece. And similarly, the third movement of Babel Maya used Morse code. Since the last letter of my SHESHACH title used Morse code, I wanted to use sort of the same form for it as well. The forms in these pieces vary between duets, between me and the other performer that I'm working with, or solos of me or the other performer with electronics. And then also there's always a few movements that, or rather I think there's just one movement that is both with electronics and a duet. What I mean is, in Babel Maya, the first movement that corresponds to the first letter here is actually only for cello and electronics, not any use of the singer Kamala in that movement. Similarly, in the fourth movement of SHESHACH, the movement is only for cello and electronics without making use of the incredible Ken Thompson, who's the person that I wrote this piece for. He's, much like Kamala, an incredible composer, but the instrument that he's mostly playing is single reed instruments. He plays both the clarinet and various sizes of saxophone throughout this piece. So, just as the third movement of Babel Maya was just for Kamala singing against electronics, in this piece, the last movement is only for Ken playing along with electronics. On that particular movement, he plays the bass sax. Once again, let's take a look at the inside of the CD. When you open it up and you'll see more of Jenny's beautiful artwork, you'll see a list of all the movements of the pieces. Last time we talked about all of these pieces. That's the 5 movements of the larger piece, Babel Maya, and we talked just briefly about how different pieces are contained inside that larger piece. Well, here are the 5 movements of SHESHACH Maya, and you see the same sort of structure, and you'll see lots of relationships between the two. For instance, as I mentioned, the first movement that corresponds to the Mayan character was a cello and electronics piece called Portrait 8. Well, the Mayan character is the 4th letter over here, and so the 4th movement is also a portrait movement for cello and electronics. You even see some of the same fun language games with made-up languages here. I mentioned before, this is the word Babel spelled out in various invented languages. By the way, this is the word SHESHACH spelled out using the same invented languages. I took those invented languages and used them over here to spell out the word portraits. Again, you've got the Tolkien Elvish language, you've got this made-up Star Wars language, some Futurama characters, the Klingon characters, and finally at the end, one of the letters from St. Thomas More's angelic alphabet that he made up for his book Utopia. Anyway, there's a lot of details and complexity here, but overall, you can see that there are some important mirrorings between the 5 movements of Babel Maya and the 5 movements of SHESHACH Maya. The last thing I wanted to do was give you at least a couple of musical examples. I mentioned in the previous video that one of the many musical languages I use when writing Babel pieces is the ancient Greek notation system, and I played you an example of that. For this piece, I want to talk about a different language that I sometimes use. Occasionally, I'll make use of the Babylonian cuneiform musical notation. Here's an example of it. This is one of the more important tablets that we've discovered so far. It's a hymn to a goddess named Nikhal, and this is the front of the piece of clay, and this is the back of it. And it's hard to see, but there are some cuneiform markings in here. Scholars have been working for quite a while now to translate the markings, the cuneiform markings, into what their musical meaning might have been. And unlike the ancient Greek notation system, we are really not secure in this. You can absolutely find some scholars who are pretty much positive they figured it out, but there's absolutely no strong consensus about exactly how the symbols would have been turned into music. It seems likely to me, and I think to a number of the real scholars that have looked at this, that probably there's a lot that's just being assumed. Any musician of the time would have known exactly what they were supposed to do with the symbols and didn't need anything made more explicit. Unfortunately for us now, that means that until we find vastly more evidence or some sort of very specific kind of primer, we're never going to know exactly how these markings translate into music. But there are some things we do know, and one of the primary ones is that the words that get written most of the time actually refer to pairs of strings on a harp-like instrument that was used in the day. And these pairings of strings have led most scholars to assume that there are certain intervals that are being called for. An interval is basically just a combination of 2 pitches. It's also the distance between those 2 pitches. If I sing ah, ah, that's a distance that we tend to call an octave, and it's a relatively big interval. And if I took a smaller interval like ah, ah, that's something that we call a minor second. Anyway, this particular notation system seems to talk about a subset of the possible intervals that exist in music, and we're not sure exactly how that would have become music, but we've got a bunch of theories. The way the notation seems to work is it will name an interval, and then it'll give a number. And that's pretty mysterious. We think maybe, I don't know, you just played that interval however many times the number says. Maybe you alternated between the 2 notes of the interval that many times. Maybe you played a scale between them. We haven't really figured that one out. In SHESHACH Maya, I use this for most of the 3rd movement, which is here. It's a piece that was written for both Ken and I to play without any kind of electronics. On this particular movement, he's playing clarinet, and I'm once again playing cello. And throughout this duet, we are just basically playing different collections of intervals by odd relationships of time. So you'll hear a gradual acceleration in tempo when you listen to the whole piece. I'm just going to play the very beginning of it so you can get an example. So as you maybe can hear, the lack of knowledge we have about that notation system led me to a sort of brutally simplistic kind of language, at least for the beginning of the movement. As the piece goes on, it gets actually quite complicated, and I give Ken all kinds of chances to squeak and squeal and growl through the instrument in some really just lovely ways that I'm sure you'll enjoy. In the previous video, I also gave an example of the f of x aspect of the piece. Remember, this involves a lot of things that contain themselves or contain variants of themselves, including melodies that actually embed themselves inside. So I played an example of a melody that lines up with itself when it's played twice as fast or 4 times as fast, etc. There's certainly a few of those melodies in the various movements of SHESHACH as well, but there's also an important usage of that is simplified and I think maybe a little bit easier to hear. Basically, I took a chromatic scale and applied the same fractal math to it so that the chromatic scale is essentially infinitely embedded inside itself. I mean, if I'm being honest, it's obviously only potentially infinite. I figured after maybe 50 or 60 years, you might get sick of listening to it. And of course, as the chromatic scale climbed up, it would get way beyond the range of human hearing. So I only gave you about a minute of it. But when you hear this kind of crazy explosion of synthesizer sounds, try to hear the embedded chromatic scale that's happening inside of it. So you might be able to hear that gradually the chromatic scales cut out whenever they get to a certain top note. I just decided arbitrarily to cut it off at that point, and it seems like the whole thing gets slower and slower and slower because we're getting to the broader examples of the chromatic scale inside. Well, I hope you found something at least vaguely interesting in this rather long video. I want to leave you with just another example from this piece. This is the ending of the record, the last thing that happens, the 5th movement of SHESHACH Maya. I'm just going to play the last 2 minutes or so. This is, as I said before, Ken Thompson on the bari sax, along with some crazy electronic sounds and some just absolute earth-ripping sounds that Ken is capable of making on his instrument. Thank you.
Alright.